Hello, welcome back for the last talk of the event. It's been seems like a long time, but a short time. Long days, but a short 3 days. Before I started NourbeSe, I just wanted to thank our research assistants, project assistants who you might have seen running around. I'd hope to introduce them to you in person, but they're always stapling things or on childcare duty or or their other jobs. But Joey Laycock, Zoe Laycock, excuse me, who's sitting there, and Katrina Gutchin and Reiko Inouye, who I think are entertaining Alice's little girl, and then it's great. They're having a great time. Yeah, thank you. And Lucas Balthazar, who maybe is around. Okay. But thank you so much for all of your help for the last little, I guess, couple of months. And they've also been meeting with Jamie Hilder, who's been mentoring them on research. They're all sort of recent graduates or still students, a couple of them here at Emily Carr at UBC. So thanks to them for their help in this. And if you want to know more, I think we've included their bios at the end, although just a correction, Zoe Laycock is misspelled in the program. Another note, you're all invited to Or Gallery after 8 o'clock tonight for a sort of wrap-up party. I was asked by someone yesterday if there's any good music or places to hear good music and dance, and I was like, you're in Vancouver. So not usually, but maybe tonight at Or Gallery we can make it happen. And another final note before I introduce the next talk is Candice Williams has an ongoing screening outdoors, so it's looping 24 hours. Just in the other side of the building when you exit, just walk along the pathway there between the tulip thing and the building, and it's about a 5-minute, the triadic ballet work, if you're familiar with that. Okay, so I see that Catherine's here. Hi, welcome. And NourbeSe. And NourbeSe's been here for a few weeks doing a residency up at Deer Lake at the Eagles House, and thanks to Shauna, who I saw briefly. And had experienced COVID in Burnaby. Not to connect those two things. Burnaby's great, but so I'm glad that NourbeSe could have a sort of West Coast adventure kind of, and survived it, and is now able to join us. So a few of the speakers these past 2 days have shared a bit about their background and ancestors to help us to understand the geographies that made them. My own ancestors come from what is now known as mainland China, India, and the African continent. The dispossession, indentured servitude, and enslavement that forced them from their homes and across 2 oceans to Trinidad only a couple of generations ago have so far made their names, their language, and their places unknowable to me. These painful histories and crossings shared by so many others have built empires and are built into our present-day mapping and experience of place, as we've heard and learned from many of those who spoke over the last 3 days. We've also learned this in the work of Katherine McKittrick and NourbeSe Philip. In No One Knows the Mysteries at the Bottom of the Ocean, the introduction to her anthology, edited with Clyde Woods, and the anthology is Black Geographies and the Politics of Place. McKittrick, referring to the transatlantic slave trade, writes of the, quote, materiality of a body of water prompts a geographic narrative that may not be readily visible on maps or nautical charts. This tension between the mapped and the unknown reconfigures knowledge, suggesting that places, experiences, histories, and people that no one knows do exist within our present geographic order, unquote. NourbeSe's writing, performance, and poetry, the most well-known being Zong, reminds us that these places, experiences, histories, people, and the violence that has almost rendered them unknowable also exists in our present legal and linguistic orders. Something that we were also reminded of by Morgan and Terry Lynn and Marianne yesterday, that we can't continue to relate and negotiate through these colonial laws and systems. And I just want to note that, yes, we are on the shores of what is now known as the Pacific, and it's not often discussed in terms of Black space and Black geographies. So I thank Tito for all the work he's doing and also for sharing some of that work with us yesterday, and encountering that idea and answering some of, or at least one of Alice's questions about what's at stake and why poets and Maori Indigenous Black scholars should delve into the archives and counter archives. And I hope I'm not phrasing that. And across the street, I just wanted to let everyone know as well, there's in relation to archives, a fantastic show by an emerging curator, local emerging curator, Nia Lewis, who's just done that at Grunt Gallery and delved into the archives here to confront us with the fact that there has long been a Black Vancouver. So thanks to Nia for doing that work. And if you can, stop by. And so yes, Katherine and NourbeSe are known for their work related to Black Atlantic studies, but we do ourselves a disservice when we think that what their writing offers has nothing to do with this place. And I really want to hand the stage screen over to Katherine and NourbeSe, so I'll just briefly go through their bios, and then I'll get off the stage and out of the way. So NourbeSe Philip was born in Tobago and moved to Canada in the 1960s to complete a master's degree in political science, followed by a law degree at the University of Western Ontario, now Western University. She practiced law in Toronto for 7 years, writing and publishing poetry in her spare time until she started writing full-time in 1983, thank goodness. Philip released her first 3 poetry collections in the 1980s, Thorns, Salmon Courage, and She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks. These books explored her identity as a Caribbean and Canadian woman, the complicated beauty of language and experience of racism, and exile as a Black woman in Canada. Her most widely known poetry collection, Zong, was published in 2008, and the book tells the true story of a slave ship from November 1781, on which 150 Africans were drowned on captain's orders so that the ship's owners could collect insurance money. Philip examined the legal text from the case to create a collection that mourns, sings, chants, and curses. And Philip's international honors include the Casa de las Americas Prize in 1988, the Tradewinds Collective Prize in 1988, a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1990, a McDowell Fellowship in 1991, and the PEN Nabokov Prize for International Literature in 2020. And then in 2021, she was awarded the Molson Arts Prize for a lifetime achievement given annually by the Canada Council for the Arts. Katherine McKittrick is Professor of Gender Studies and Canada Research Chair in Black Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. And she authored Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Struggle, published in 2006, and edited and contributed to Sylvia Winter on Being Human as Praxis in 2015. Her most recent monograph, Their Science and Other Stories, in 2021, is an exploration of Black methodologies. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yes?
I can hear you.
It's great to see you, Katherine. We live in the same city, but we haven't seen each other. Actually, the last time was at U of T, yes? We did that panel. Yeah. I just want to thank first off, I want to thank the Musqueam people for having me and all of us here. My ancestors thank their ancestors. I want to thank the hard work, Jamie, Denise, Morgan, Jordan, and all the Zoe, who gifted me with a pair of earrings today, and Katrina, and just everybody. It's been just really, really exciting to hear the papers. And there's a lot of, and they're going to be, I think, we talked this morning, there are going to be a lot of things that we're talking about that will pick up on what has been talked about here. So I just wanted to say that first and foremost, and to pass it to Katherine to say a few words as well.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for the invitation, for the opportunity to be with you virtually as well. It's difficult for me to travel at this time. I want to also I want to thank NourbeSe. I think that I've been writing about her work since I was a MA student, and one of my first essays on geography was on displaced, the space between. And I've always kind of thought about how her work provides a geographic grammar for liberation that was always in place. And so I want to thank her for all of her work, but especially I'm really excited to be here today for her to agree to be in conversation with me, but also just to think a little bit about the stakes of radical friendship and the kinds of connections you can make, not in so public conversations like this, but this also works, but also in one-on-one conversations as well. So I want to just send my appreciation to the West Coast from Toronto here, to you, NourbeSe, as well. And so we're going to start, I think, with a short clip that NourbeSe has provided, and then we have a series of touchstones that we want to share with you about the possibilities and limitations of water.
Yeah, we were both saying this morning when we talked that it's easier for us to write this stuff. I wrote out these notes last night, although it's supposed to be conversation, and it's like, you know, anyway, so I just want to say too that, and just to echo the opening, Katherine talked about this place, the space between. I come from this very tiny island, Tobago, and it's the place I write from always. I don't write about it necessarily, but it's the land I stand on. And we'll talk about beauty at the end. There's something about the beauty of that place that I think has really generated actually all of my writing, the beauty and the pain. It's not just the beauty. So without further ado, I should just set this up very quickly. This is about a 3-minute clip that was taken at the, let's see, it was the years are going to escape me, maybe 2018. The West Indian Literature Conference was held in Miami. And this takes place, this is a clip of a performance of a section of Zong on, it may be the only remaining Black-owned beach in Miami, and it's on prime waterfront. So it's really wonderful that it's still owned by Black folk there. And of course, all the resonances with it taking place on the ocean, and the fact that it's still in Black hands. And you'll see the performance, and then we can use that as a launching pad to begin to talk. Do I do anything, or can it be done from up there? I have to do so. Okay.
This be not. Should be. Calm, please. Why are we here? Drums. Why are we here? Drums. Why are we here? Drums. Where are we? Why are we here? And 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 where are we? And where are you? Why are we here? City on death. Murder. 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 A death. A lair. Negroes run. Oh my soul. Oh my soul. Oh yeah, yeah, Lantito. Oh yeah, yeah, Lantito. Oh yeah, yeah, Lantito. Oh yeah, yeah, Lantito. Oh yeah, yeah, Lantito.
I should have said this before. The other person in the video is Professor Yannick Hume from UWI, not Mona, Cave Hill, Barbados. She is also a dancer, choreographer, and Santeria priestess. And she performed along with me at that particular event. Catherine, you want to maybe?
Yeah. Can you see me, because I've lost there you are. Okay. So we wanted to begin with the clip because one of our questions or prompts for this conversation was to think about water and to think about the connections between water and land. And to begin with a Black-owned beach was interesting to us because of how we understand tourism in the Caribbean, tourism outside of the Caribbean, but tourism in the Caribbean, and how some beaches are reserved for guests only. And this idea of the beach being a commonplace, but also a place of restriction and segregation. And so to begin with, the Black-owned beach kind of overturns the assumption of those restricted guest-only beach areas, but at the same time, it overturns them, but it's at the same time signals those beaches as well. So we were thinking a lot about the simultaneity of, as I said earlier, the possibilities and limitations of water. And we landed on the beach. And NourbeSe offered this as a jumping off point for us to think about. The beach as a public space, the beach as a site of segregation, this beach as a commons, but also as a place of like a invocation of private property. And so those are some of the early ideas that we've talked about, but we've also been thinking about the other kind of more difficult ideas around water, I guess. Boiling water advisories. Today I was thinking about the countdown that happened in Cape Town in, I think it was 2020 or 2019, 2020, where they were literally counting down water usage, and you weren't allowed to wash your car. You weren't allowed to, they put all these restrictions because of the desertification. And so we're thinking also not just about we're also thinking about the lack of water and what's at stake in the lack of water. And we all know that this is connected to climate change and climate crisis and climate catastrophe as well. So there's a lot here for us to think about, particularly because water is also, as the materiality of water, it moves through your fingers. You can't quite grasp it. And so it holds all of this. It's almost like a perfect literary device in some ways. So there's also those kinds of questions, water as a metaphor, but also water as like, the thing that it is what sustains us. So those were some of our early questions. NourbeSe, do you want to add to that?
Yes. There's so many things that just have spun off from what you were saying. I was thinking again this morning, last night, we begin life in water, all of us. We begin in our mother's wombs. And I'm thinking of the Haitian voodoo belief that we end life for the year and a half, 1 year plus 1 day after we die. The soul is believed to return to water, and at which point you have a ceremony of the dead. George Lamming writes really beautifully about this, in which the living and the dead commune about the future. So it's really fascinating way in which water becomes that transition zone. Catherine mentioned the Black-owned beach. I'm thinking of the film Life and Death. Some of you may have seen it. It's a film that really uncovers the obscenity of tourism. In Jamaica, for instance, most of the beaches where hotels are located are not accessible to the public, which is not the case in Trinidad and Tobago, or I believe in Barbados, although of course there are ways they can get around that by making it somewhat inaccessible, even though once you're there, you can't be told to leave. So I think those are really important aspects to think about as well. In our conversation, we talked, I wanted to share this. I wanted to start or continue. We have a saying back home, and I'll go into the vernacular. The sea don't have no back door. The sea don't have no back door, meaning that once you go into the ocean, you have to be aware that you might not be coming out. And I was saying to Catherine this morning, and thinking about that, I was thinking about the fact that we say it in the Caribbean now, or at least in Trinidad and Tobago, but it also applies in a retrospective way to those who were leaving Africa because there was no return, actually. And there is no return. Even if we physically return, it's a very different return. We don't often have the languages, the culture, and so on. I don't know if you want to pick up on some of those things, Catherine.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I do. I think that as Hartman shows in Lose Your Mother, the return to the door is one of terribleness, right? You can't return. That's part of the story that she's telling. And I think that one of the But one of the things that's important to me about, or what struck me about thinking about the beaches and thinking about private property and my own preoccupation with the plantation, and I think it's Micheline Critchlow who's written on the plantation, or written on resorts as iterations of the plantation. And so there is this kind of entanglement between the past and the present are entangled, and how when we were speaking earlier today, you said, you know, we arrived on the plantation, like this is what, you know, this was a kind of a beginning, or this is the extension of the Middle Passage as well. And to think about these kinds of restrictions around the occupation of a beach, who owns the water, and also the militarization of the water, and to go back to desertification and drought and things like that, private property, racial capitalism, all these kinds of things that kind of swirl and produce water as scarcity, and how that is kind of mapped onto the plantation in particular kinds of ways, and actually provides the conditions for what I've talked about as called plantation futures, right? It's the plantation is kind of thrust into the future, but it's not the same, right? Those beaches aren't a plantation, but they have traces of plantation logics within them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so there's something I think important there around, yeah.
So I was really struck. You wouldn't have seen it, but in the previous presentation with the offerings on the beach. So I want to sort of link that to what we're talking about. I was thinking about, and the way it disrupts that plantation logic that you're talking about. Maybe 5 years ago, I was in Trinidad. I've been there since, but I attended a festival, an Olokun festival on the beach. In the south part of the island. So a quick survey, the Yoruba of Nigeria, their traditional indigenous practices, one called Ifa. And in Ifa, there is the deity of sweet water. Well, there are three kinds of water. There's sweet water, tutu. There is salt water, Yamaya, and in Brazil, there's a lot of honoring of Yamaya, the goddess of the sea. And very much like we saw in the previous presentation, offerings are taken out early in the year, January or February, fruit and flowers and so on. But there's also Olokun, and Olokun is the deity of the deep waters, supposedly where life begins. And it is believed that there is a whole life underneath there that Olokun rules. And so I attended this Olokun festival on the beach. And it was fascinating. You know, the priest was there and we were there. And cheek by jowl with that, there was a group of South Asians, this is Trinidad, who were also having their own festival. It was a sort of barbecue or a curry cue, as it's called, right? And it was absolutely amazing because you saw the hybridity right there. We were doing our thing, they were doing their thing, and the beach was reclaimed in a way that really disrupted that plantation system. What's also fascinating, linking to many of the presentations here, is that the priest said they used to take the offerings out on a boat, and this is what you're supposed to do. But the last few times, every time they went out, someone drowned. So they were no longer doing that. So they actually put the offerings into the water. But I just wanted to sort of bring that in as a way in which, you know, the folk have managed to reclaim those spaces. And one last thing I was thinking, there was something today I sat and I thought, oh, but no one has talked about sexuality and eroticism as it relates to the sea. And the reason I'm saying that is that in Tobago in particular, you can very seldom buy fish without someone warning you about the fact it's going to make you very sexually at night. I recall some years ago, I was on the beach and where we were living at the time, they were pulling seine, which is the big seines they throw, and the fish are leaping on the beach. And so we would go down and buy the fish. And this very portly fisher lady said to me, "You're going to be active tonight." And I sort of looked up, like, what do you mean? And she sort of moves her waist, and so it's very common. And for instance, sea moss, which is a drink from Trinidad, women weren't supposed to drink sea moss. Only men drink sea moss because it's supposed to make them virile and things like that. So I just thought, that's something that I haven't heard, but I was thinking, but it's so much a part of the lore of the sea, and what the product of the sea does for you. And I'll just say this one thing, and then Katherine, you can let me know what you think. In Southern Africa, there is this belief that when you eat the products of the land, you're actually ingesting the ancestors, and you become one with the ancestors. And I was thinking about this last night. I was wondering, well, does that apply to the sea? If we're eating the products of various, and this is a question, I really don't have an answer to it, to Katherine and to the audience, maybe later on if we take a couple of questions. On that note, I'll just throw it back to you, Katherine. And
yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've been interested in my work is Sylvia Wynter's plot from Plot and Plantation, and thinking about the grave or a cemetery, the slave cemetery. And I've also talked a little bit in my work about the African burial ground, and thinking about what happens to the geography of the soil when those bones are in there, and what does it mean that the bones seep into the soil, and does it change the composition of the soil? Well, of course it does, right? And so there's something really beautiful, and well, for me, again, I always use the word terrible because I think it's so poignant, but it's like the beautiful terribleness of death, where it kind of it seeps into the soil. And for me, why that's interesting is because it changes the geography of the soil. It actually changes the land itself. And many years ago, like probably about 6 or 7 years ago, one of my students, Danielle Houghton, and I'll never forget this, it just sits with me, and I think about it like weekly, where she was thinking about lynching, and she said, what happens when our blood goes into the soil? What happens to the soil, when that happens? And it kind of is there. So there is something about, there's something really, really meaningful about that connection between ecology, humanity, decay, and so on. And I think this is something that I've got from Zong as well. I think that one of the lessons of Zong isn't about a finality. It's about the continuity of not just those stories, but the actual composition, the actual human the flesh. I don't want to use the flesh for some reason. I'm avoiding it, but do you know what I'm saying? So there is something there's something important for us to think about there, and then how we consume that.
I had a moment like that. I was watching the film, some of you may know it, the series, The Underground Railroad, based on Colson Whitehead's book. And I haven't finished watching it. It's very difficult, but there's a scene early in the series when somebody's being whipped. And there was a moment when I had that exact thought. I thought, our blood has seeped into this land. And what does that mean? I don't have an answer at this moment. I know it means something. But what does that mean for us who have come here, particularly those of us who have come unwillingly, but have, changed the ecology through that? But I also wanted to continue with your thought, which is, what does it mean? There's the word to exhume, which is to take the body out of the soil. And I coined this word in the essay in Zong, to ex aqua. I mean, how do we ever get those bones back? And what does it mean when we have this ocean that is actually a graveyard? And I said to you this morning, and I'll just share with the audience, that in Trinidad, we make a distinction between the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, I was sharing with Catherine that people are told if you go to swim on the Atlantic side, people say, make sure and take your passport with you, because there's a sense in which you might not come back. Whereas the Caribbean side is seen as much more gentle, and people feel much more at home there. But I was wondering if we could talk a bit about how the Atlantic has been mapped. You know, I'm thinking of the presentations this morning, and you and I were talking about it as well. This whole idea of that it's not the commons, it is commercialized, has always been commercialized. And I was sharing with Catherine that I was reading a work on a man called John Harrison, who discovered longitude. In 1730, he designed this clock. I see people nodding. Huge prizes were being offered for people to come up with a way to measure longitude. And Catherine pointed this out this morning, that how so much of what we live with today is invested in Black life and Black bodies. It was that important because there were some 300 plus trips being made from the UK to the Caribbean. And if they lost a slave ship, it was a tremendous loss. They understood latitude because of the sun. They didn't know how to measure how far they were from port. They wanted to be able to do that because they've traveled on fixed routes, but which also meant that pirates could be there and so on. So they wanted to be able to navigate. Now, what I find fascinating, going back to what we talked about yesterday, this is the same time, based on my research, that Polynesian navigators are navigating those seas using the sun, the moon, the stars, wind currents, and swells. And those people are seen as the indigenous here somehow less than. And in England, they're trying to develop this way of measuring longitude. Their way of measuring it was to throw a log off the ship and try and see how long it took to get from that log. It was called dead reckoning. So there was a deep investment in finding a way to measure longitude, which in fact John Harrison did eventually. In 1730, he came up with this clock, which he improved, I think, 3 or 4 times. And that's how they were able to develop longitude so that they could transport more slaves, among other things. But I just wanted to, we talked about that this morning. And you talked in your book, Dear Science, about this map that some of you may have seen called, maybe you can take it from there. You know what I'm talking about, of how they have condensed that into that 2-minute, the 2-minute.
Yeah, the 2-minute mapping of slave transportations that was circulating on the internet maybe a decade ago or so. Maybe it was less, I don't remember, because we are all in COVID time, so we actually don't know what day it is. But it was this map, and I've seen a similar one with lynchings in the US specifically. But what the map has, all of the ships going from port to port, from point A along the triangle, and it's sped up, and it's done in record time. And it's meant to move us and allow us to feel how monumental slavery was, because it keeps going and going and going, and there's more and more and more ships. But what it also does in that is it erases, it functions to dehumanize that entire process. It functions to dehumanize everyone involved, Black and non-Black, so that it's almost cartoonish. But it's circulated like fact. it's circulated on the internet like fact, like saying, look at how terrible this is, look at how terrible this is. And again, that I think that that's one of the things that we have to hold on to, is the technologies of modernity and how they try to capture something, and capture particular people. In this case, it would be the enslaved, and create a kind of a window for us to have some sort of connection to them. And how when we watch that, at least when I do, and I think when Black people watch that, it can't do that work. And part of it is that some of this is unspeakable. Some of this shouldn't be told, or it shouldn't be told in a way that's legible and easy. It has to be a kind of, we have to, if we're going to tell it, we have to tell it in a way that it expresses the untellability, the unspeakability of this. And so those are, I mean, I think that Glissant's abyss is something that we've talked about, NourbeSe and I, and what if the abyss is the place? It's not something that's mappable. It's actually nauseating, right? He kind of gives us that kind of grammar. It's like, this should actually make you want to vomit because it's so terrible. It should move you to feeling that level of nausea. And then for me, a text like Zong provides a visual grammar for what is unspeakable. And the only way that, at least for me, that Zong is speakable is if it is done in collaboration. It's not for individual, it can't be a neoliberal project. It cannot, like, it just completely undoes that. So there's a lot there, but I think that that's kind of getting at the complexity of the water and what the water means for Black folks in particular. It is always that contradiction. I was looking today a little bit at tidalectics, at Brathwaite's tidalectics, and how that's it's like kind of a poetic model of history. A lot of people use it as a methodology, tidalectics, and it is always that, I think you said it earlier on, NourbeSe, it's the beauty that is kind of interlaced with terrible poverty of the Caribbean, right? And so it's this gorgeousness and this lushness that has this other story that you cannot delink, right? You can't just sit there with the beauty. The beauty comes with something else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And so that may be a good segue for us to talk about beauty, but before we get there, I was thinking as well, you and I talked about this, Katherine, and it was mentioned in a couple of presentations, diving. I want to share with you, if you haven't seen it, there's a documentary, 6-part documentary called Enslaved, narrated by Samuel L. Jackson. It's Canadian, in which he follows these groups of African divers who have been diving slave ship wrecks. Suriname, at least in this particular series, Suriname, Portugal, we'll just say UK and Brazil, I believe. And I shared with Katherine something that someone sent me, it may have been Alyssa Trotz, but I looked it up again last night, that there's supposed to be some deep sea mining of the Atlantic. And there was a group of academics who got together and are asking that a certain area of the Atlantic become a part of the tangible and intangible heritage that should be memorialized as the final resting place of the victims of the slave trade. That was someone from the Ocean Foundation. And interestingly enough, they quoted Lucille Clifton's, the poem that Dr. Swan mentioned yesterday. She spoke about the Atlantic being a bridge of ivory for all the African bones that lie between the continents. I don't know what has happened with that. The date on that is December 10th, 2020. I got notice of it, I think maybe last year, we're in 22, yeah. So I'm not sure what has happened there, but I just thought I would share that with you. In terms of the presentation we saw yesterday with the divers and today as well, the previous, all the presentations today. So this was a poem I shared with Katherine this morning, and I want to read it. It's not my own. It's by a man called Roach. He was from Tobago, born in Mount Pleasant, and he never left the island. He refused to leave the island. He actually drank insecticide and swam out from Quinam Bay in Trinidad and killed himself. So he is a contemporary of, it would be Walcott, Lamming, Louise Bennett. In fact, he belongs, Claude Mackay and those people. And this is a poem I found this morning, which I think captures so much of what we've all talked about here today. He died in 1974. He walked into the ocean and drowned. It's a terrible thing. Love overgrows a rock. So I thought I would read this and we would talk a little bit about it, about the beauty, and Katherine has said it so well already. And then maybe we could take some questions. When are we wanting to end, Denise? We're at 4 o'clock now. I know we started late, but there may be some questions. Okay, all right. Okay. So this is Eric Roach's poem, Love Overgrows a Rock. There's a word I had to look up, E-Y-O-T, Eyot. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it the right way. It's an old English word meaning a small island. Only the foreground's green. Waves break the middle distance. And to horizon, the Atlantic's spread, bright, blue, and empty as the sky. My Eyot jails the heart, and every dream is drowned in the shore water. Too narrow room pressed down my years to stunted scrub, blunted my sister's beauty and my friend's grave force, our tribes renewing faith and pride. Love overgrows a rock as blood outbreeds it. We take banana boats, tourist, stowaway, our luck in hand, calypsos in the heart. We turn Columbus's blunder back from sun to snow to bitter cities. We explore the hostile, exploding zones. The drunken hawk's blood of the poet streams through the climates of the mind, seeking a word's integrity, a human truth. So from my private hillock in Atlantic, I join cry. Come, sain the archipelago, disdain the sea, gather the island's hills into the blue horizons of our love.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it just captures everything, the containers, the commercialization, the leaving, the bodies, the people leaving, never coming back. And something I wanted to talk about, which was linguistics and language. Katherine, you mentioned the Middle Passage, which the Hindus call the Kalapani, the dark water. And, I've always felt we don't have a word for it. We, African peoples, because to my mind, the Middle Passage, yesterday we were talking about language and, as a poet, I'm always struggling with, and particularly speaking this foreign tongue, English. What do we call this thing? I mean, Kalapani, to my mind, sums it up more than the Middle Passage, which is this very objective, neutral, erasing expression, So it was something I was thinking about, around language and how do we name, and if we can't name it, we've experienced it. The abyss, even the abyss is better than the Middle Passage, it gets to something about what was happening there. But I'm throwing this out to the audience as well, like struggling with how do we name these experiences, yeah.
And what I mean, I'm thinking as well about one of the things, one of my struggles, and we began this with water, and we talked about it as like the kind of what can water do for us? What can it do? How can it tell a story? How does it work? And one of the things is like, what happens when we don't pay attention to the materiality of the geography, or the physical geography specifically, and what happens when, for example, the Middle Passage is called a womb, or it's called a tomb, which we've heard that too, and the kind of brutality, and it forecloses possibility. So there's just something about that, how it is inutterable, or even the abyss is metaphoric, right? Like it's working on that level, but he's trying to get at that brutality in a way that is because you don't want to replicate the violence as well, and that's why I don't like womb or tomb or this kind of business. And so we wanted to end with beauty, and so is there any way to end with beauty, if we don't have words for that terribleness? Do we have words for NourbeSe? And I'm obsessed with flying cheekbones, and I have been. I think I wrote you 8 months ago and told you that, and it's because of that. It's because of this. In what language am I beautiful?
Am I beautiful?
Yeah. So and just like, anyway, so I will write about it if I can someday, but I think that that's what's at stake here, is if the violence is unspeakable, is the beauty of Black creative worlds also unspeakable? And I think in some ways it is. I think in the poem that you read, there's so much that can't be said, that the words explode, and tell us something that we physiologically feel but aren't on the page. And I feel like that with Black music too, all music actually, but specifically, yeah.
So the way I want to follow up on that, and it continues to link with beauty, is this. My former son-in-law is from Zimbabwe. And in Zimbabwe, there are a lot of stories about mermaids and people being taken by mermaids and so on. And when I first met him, he told a story about the fact that there's a belief that that people are sometimes taken away to a watery kingdom or queendom, their loved ones are not supposed to show too much grief, because if they do, they will not come back. It's very interesting. I'm thinking about it now in terms of our experience. When those people come back, they come back with greater spiritual strength and powers. I remember when I first heard the story, I thought, but that's our story. There's a sense in which, we were taken away by the water, and that when we're now rebirthed in the Caribbean and have been producing this beauty in terms of the scholars and the writers, and just driving so much of how, and this for me is a sort of lead into your comments this morning about modernity and how this experience really disrupts, the sort of classic idea of modernity. that you were talking about this morning.
Yeah.
The experience
Yeah.
of the slave ship and the abyss and so on.
And that you can't, I mean, you know, Toni Morrison talks about it so beautifully in Playing in the Dark, that you can't make sense of the world without that she calls it an Africanist presence, right? And so there is, like, even in the shadows, there's that nothing in it. And as you noted earlier, like around the longitude and latitude, like nothing. We need that in order for the world to move forward. And it shows that modernity requires Blackness. It requires a particular kind of a Black narrative or Black presence. And I think that then the Black community kind of takes that and it unravels into something that was unexpected, right? Outside objecthood.
Yeah. So we can take a pause here and take if there are any questions to either of us.
Thank you.
You can't see Catherine.
That was really incredible. I really appreciate how you can both speak off the cuff and keep it so engaging. And I think I'm thinking about is when you're talking about water is both like, it has this kind of ambivalence as a figure. It's good, it's bad, there's beauty in it, but also a threat. You're talking about it being related to both like birth and death. I appreciate the resistance to like metaphor in terms of how metaphor functions, thinking of it in terms of displacement, how you can talk about something without necessarily talking about something or provide a figure to think alongside something. So I'm just really thinking about sort of like how that like linguistic function of the metaphor, thinking about if you can maybe sort of go into or speak about sort of that linguistic capacity of it, like what does that displacement mean? Or if you could just speak reflexively about sort of like how you've been sort of talking through ideas of metaphor over this conversation, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I can start, and then maybe NourbeSe can add. For me, this has been a long-standing preoccupation of mine, thinking about how the metaphor functions, particularly in relation to Black studies and Black geographies. And one of the reasons is because because so often the metaphor is put in place in an analysis to explain something, and often when it's doing the explanation, or when it's being explained, when what is being explained, I'm going to talk about, like, for example, the womb or the tomb. When it is enunciated, it empties out the materiality of what the metaphor does. So to give another example that's a little bit easier to grasp onto, or about, it may even be the same, in geography, the idea that space just is, or that you can throw around the word space and place without talking about location and the materiality of the location, obfuscates what actually happens in space and place. And so there are different ways that metaphor functions, I think, in scholarly work, where it takes away from that materialism. It takes away from different processes like capitalism, like patriarchy, and these types of things. And it allows us to kind of safely rest on something that is just a word. So I'm sorry, I'm not super articulate about this. I would blame COVID. I also, I just am recovering from COVID. So I'm a little bit groggy right now, but I hope that gets at what I'm thinking about in relation to your question, which is, there is a simultaneity with metaphor. There is a materiality to it, and there is an imaginative or literary function to it. And I think that we have to hold those things together in order for it to do the kind of work that it should do. Otherwise, the Middle Passage becomes a tomb. It doesn't become a site of possibility. It replicates racial violence over and over again. And so anyway, I will stop there, but I hope that gets at what you were asking. I don't know if I got at the linguistic function necessarily, but those are some of the things that I've been thinking about for a few years.
Yeah, I don't know if I can help you anymore. I mean, I think a lot about metaphor. I was thinking about it this morning, and I'm going to say something that may sound really, I think metaphor is really necessary. I think we need, as linguists, I think as humans, we need it to help get us through. But I think I agree with what Katherine is saying. We have to be really, really careful. And I think it works maybe differently in poetry or in literature than in academic writing. Although Simone White, the African-American poet, I saw her give a talk where she has been talking about the need to get rid of metaphor, or not to use metaphor at all in poetry, which I understand. Yeah. So just because it's been used, particularly around African Americans and so on, it has been overused. So I think it's a very important area. It's what I was going to say is, I think that there's a way in which we humans are metaphors for something else, like literally and physically we are metaphors for spirit, maybe for the universe, however we want to come at it. And maybe that is why it's so foundational to us as a device. But I think all the more reason, like religion, why we have to be so careful about how and when we use it and what work it's doing. Because what Katherine is saying is really important, because I think that there's so much that is like that map, and it's very recent, Katherine. It was upgraded in I was at Emory in 2018, and there was an upgrade to the map.
Right.
I think that there is and this morning, I'm sorry if let's see, is it Dr. Franca? Is that, yeah? You talked about this. Someone, I'm sure it was you. The need to understand that way of thinking that we're living with, and was it you or someone else mentioned that something has to die for something new to get born, which is why at the end of Zong, the officer, the captain, whoever he is, jumps overboard and joins his victim. It's not a metaphor. He actually joins his victim to suggest that what he represents in this work has to die for something new to get born. I don't think I'm going to see what is new, but I am reminded of what Morgan talked about the first day, and I responded to him. Help me. My response to him was that we Africans understood that you could not make of a human being a thing. It was why we ran. It was why we broke tools. It's why we killed our children, as Toni Morrison wrote about. That there's another idea of freedom outside and above this legal definition of freedom. We always knew that. And he had spoken about something in Indigenous culture that spoke to that, to this understanding that what they're talking about is larger than the system that we're living with. And how did I get there from metaphor? It's an important issue. I don't know if anyone else wants to contribute to the discussion about it, because it's something that we're all grappling with. I don't think there are any easy answers to it. I was just looking to see if Roach had used any metaphors. Yeah, he's used a few. He talks about his years being stunted scrub. He talks about yeah, stunted snow. Yeah, he's using it in different ways. Yeah, he's using the technique. Yeah. Anyway, it's necessary.
I think it is, and I think I'm trying to. I mean, one of the reasons I became interested in thinking about metaphor, and I agree with you, NourbeSe. I think we do need metaphor. We need something that is kind of. So I've always been. We need to do metaphor well, right? we don't want to be lazy, and so. One really sort of very easy example to think about is Bell Hooks's concept of the margin, right? From margin to center and so on and so forth. And the ways that got taken up in the 80s and the 90s, it emptied out of everything that she ever said was like this. She talks about the margin as a space of radical openness. She talks about it as a space that's productive, that's generative, that is a feminist space, that is, anti-white supremacist. Like she kind of gives us all of this, that's what's happening on the margin, and then it got metaphorized into nothing, right? And I think that's sort of that's the risk, I think, of over metaphorizing something or sort of relying too heavily on it, because then the materiality, the reality, because she was talking about classrooms, she was talking about conferences, she was talking about actual geographic locations where the margin actually exists. So there's a few ways that we can kind of think about this, and geography is always especially useful for thinking about how it functions and how that place of possibility always has to be paired with that groundedness. The groundedness of the metaphor. We were talking about this earlier, NourbeSe, around disability and aphasia, which Frank Wilderson uses, and other dysgraphia, other types of things where there's like a groundedness, there's a livingness to the metaphor that we have to pay attention to. Otherwise, it becomes problematic.
Well, so to continue with that, I have a collection of essays, the first collection I wrote, I think, called Frontiers. And Bell Hooks was writing around the same time as I was doing that. And one of the meanings of, I'm trying to think, one of the meanings of frontiers is also margins. I wanted to avoid using margins, but of course, frontiers has its own history of what the frontier is, particularly in North America and so on. But there was a sense in which the reason why I stuck with the title was because my being in Canada, I really felt that unlike the US and unlike England, both of which places have a long tradition of Black writing or writing by Black folk, Canada didn't, although George Eliot Clark has criticized me on this. I still maintain
You're
that.
right.
Yes. And so
You're right.
I've always felt that the work I've done in Canada, I could never have done anywhere else because of this. The land is not by any means empty. Having come across on the train, it is not empty, and we've talked about this. I've talked to other people about this, but there's a sense in which there was, for me as a Black person in this country, a kind of nothingness there, a nothingness to who I am, where do I see myself, in what language am I beautiful, that had I been in the US, I would have had to have contended with Phyllis, the tradition going back to the queen of metaphor, Phyllis Wheatley, Had I been in England, I would have had to have contended with the whole history of empire in that way, and the Commonwealth and all the writings coming from there. Yes, in Canada, it was a totally different situation. So there's that sense in which it could only have been done here in this kind of space of negative space, to use another metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah, and isn't that interesting too, NourbeSe? Because I mean, the one thing that Canada is it's such a troubling space, and I feel like we're just we're coming to terms with the ways in which slavery has impacted this nation, whether like Camille Turner's work on how slave ships were built in Newfoundland, for example, and these types of things, but also Afua Cooper's work on Mary Joseph Angelique, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is that history lurking there, but it's never as, I mean, when you think about the island of Jamaica, the entire island being a plantation, for example, and what's at stake in that. And so there's this murkiness here. And I know that there are some of my graduate students or undergraduate students don't feel that murkiness in the same way. They have a very different understanding of Black Lives Matter, of what, you know, the history of transatlantic slavery in Canada, that wasn't kind of, you had to search out for, you had to go to the archives to find this kind of thing. And so there is that contradiction of Canada that's really interesting. But what's also interesting is like when you talk about how you write from the place of Tobago, right? And so it's like truly a diasporic stretch that you're thinking about, like that, a geographic stretch where you're writing from the place of Tobago within this space of absented presence of Canada. There's a point in Black Skin, White Masks, I don't know where he says I existed in triple, right? And so there's
Can you repeat that?
Where Fanon says I existed in triple.
Yes, or quadruple. Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you both for this. This is so interesting. I wanted to just return to the question of naming, and I guess maybe it's also about metaphor. You mentioned that when you were talking about this ceremony on the Black Beach in Miami, that you were reclaiming the beach. And as you said that, I thought of this illustration that's in Linton Kwesi Johnson's book, Voices of the Living and the Dead. And it's of a giant wave crashing on the shoreline. And under the wave are all of the ancestors who were thrown off the ship, right? And so I thought that was so different than the way I'm usually thinking about beach reclamation, because this is also the language that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers uses when they dredge sand from the bottom of the ocean and bring it to the beach to artificially shore it up so that we all think it's really a beach when it's actually ocean. And so I was just thinking about, you know, those two different uses of the word reclamation and the idea of the, you know, thinking of the ocean as a place that's not just a tomb, but a place of hope, maybe, as I said yesterday, right? And like that it's a hopeful way to think about the flood, right? As a sort of reclamation of Black people on this shoreline doing this ritual. But then I thought, what happens to the Black beach, right? Because the waters are rising and the floods will come, and Miami is one of those places that is artificially extended into the sea. And I wonder if that Black beach will be there much longer, and if you talked about that when you were there.
The idea of reclamation and just using the word, before I came up here, I was thinking about this. When I think of the work of Zong and being on the beach, I see it as a form of reparations, actually, in the moment, because I think that there are certain kinds of reparation that only we can give ourselves, because there's no, and I heard this recently, an Indigenous person was saying this, and I have been saying it as well, there is no amount of money in the world that can ever, 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 ever repair, restore what was broken, what was lost. So it's not about money, although it is about money. In the sense that money will help to make certain things possible. So it's a reclamation of some sort of history, some sort of acknowledgement that they should be there. This morning, Catherine, you talked about ideas of the swimming pool and Black people. You talked about Black people. If Lena Horne, you said, put her toe in a pool and they had to drain the entire pool. Do you know the way that Black bodies that are so linked to water then become seen as contaminating beings?
I think as well, one of the things, this is such a great entryway into thinking about the production of space and thinking about Black geographies, because if the beach disappears, I think what will happen is that Black folks will find another place to think through and creatively work on reparations and the call for reparations. And one of the things, while the Black beach is important, this is also invoking glissant for those nerds in the house. That Black beach and that man walking across the Black beach in Poetics. So there's the sand is Black. So there's that there too. But I think one of the things is that Black beach, if we think about it in relation to the Black Atlantic, if we think about it in relation to offshore humanism, and those are both Gilroy's, if we think about it in relation to Zong, if we think about it in relation to Displace, and Clyde Woods's blues epistemologies, and all of these, Ruthie Gilmore's work on prison abolition or an abolition geography, that Black geographies aren't about owning and claiming space. They're about providing new or working with existing and extending practices of liberation. And so what that means is we should be focusing on climate catastrophe rather than sort of what that's about, losing that particular place or that particular space. And so what does it mean to understand geography, as Morrison said, without the mandate for conquest? And then your comments are so, your comments then get amplified into asking us to think completely differently about what that Black beach means, because it means that we have to be continually moving, just continually moving. And it might just be our imagination that's moving at some points, but there is something about not being pinned down to a geography and not trying to own it and practice exclusion. And we began with the commons, and we talked a little bit about the commons. One of the things that David Harvey says, the geographer, is the real problem is around private property, not the commons itself, and not sharing common resources. But we have to focus on the ways which capitalism and racial capitalism are producing these geographies as though we can have them and keep them forever. Black people, Black people have never been able to do that. So there's something in that methodology, I think, that's useful about how to create a kind of more open understanding of what geography is outside of,
And I think that is what I was getting at when I was saying, when I talked about that myth, that story about something, you come back with new powers. Because I think that is the gift, I think, that this horrific experience has bestowed on us. This, Catherine, you said we have to keep moving. I don't think there's any other alternative, that we do keep moving. We have always kept moving, and that will continue. Yeah. I think it's in the nature of the beast in terms of what has happened. Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm getting the look from Denise. 4:34. Thank you. It was really lovely. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks everybody.
Thank you, Denise.